Welcome to today's edition of the IntoTexas AI podcast. It's your look at AI news and trends impacting Texas. I'm your host, Shannon Belew. Let's get started. Today, we're taking a retro look back at Texas technology in the 90s, focused on the companies, computing shifts, semiconductor foundations, and entrepreneurial culture that helped set the stage for today's AI economy in Texas. Let's dig in. This week, a Swiss watchmaker called Swatch stirred up fans with the release of a new, much talked about timepiece. If you don't know Swatch, it was super popular in the 90s, but has continued to have a steady presence in the retail market. So with this week's launch giving off all those retro vibes, I thought it would be fun to take a trip back to the 90s and see what was happening in the tech space in Texas at that time. After all, there's a lot of tech history that helped pave the way for today's AI-fueled growth across the state. So now, let's turn back the clock to 1983. That's the year that Swatch launched. And in case you're wondering, I tried really hard to find a connection between Swatch and Texas, but other than having a super loyal fan base here, that's about it. However, I will say, I think it's interesting that Swatch was created with a vision of being low cost, but high tech and artistic as a watch. It was coming out of a time when the company and Swiss watchmakers in general were facing pressure from the growth of digital watches. So Swatch was really about trying to bring back some of the business to the Swiss mechanical watchmakers who had lost popularity in favor of those digital watchmakers, largely from Japan, like Seiko. So maybe the connection between Swatch and Texas is this. Swatch represents a time when the world was rapidly moving toward a new digital existence, and traditional businesses and workers were trying to find a way to stay relevant. I think that definitely resonates today and probably sounds familiar to some of us. Okay, so what about those retro tech vibes? Let's dig in and take a look. All right, so let's go back to May 1983. The personal computer is still new enough to feel like a curiosity, but powerful enough that business leaders are starting to understand something big is happening. There are no smartphones, no cloud apps, no ChatGPT, no Claude, no AI copilots sitting inside a workplace software. If you want to move data, you're probably using a floppy disk. And if you want to connect to another machine, you are entering the world of modems, terminals, and early networks. And yet, if you look closely at Texas in the early 90s, I think you can see the outline of the AI economy that we talk about today. In Houston, there is a startup called Compaq, and it was proving that a Texas company could challenge IBM in personal computing. In Dallas, you had Texas Instruments pushing deeper into semiconductors, business computing, and even some voice-enabled systems that we'll talk about in a minute. And then in Austin, you had a young Michael Dell preparing to arrive at the University of Texas, where he would soon begin building and selling PCs from his dorm room. And then you had an interesting moment that was happening far away from Texas. It was in Aspen, where Apple's Steve Jobs was giving a speech. The speech actually occurred in June of 1983, but it was at a design conference. This was a speech that had been lost for decades and eventually resurfaced. I think Forbes did an article about it. I found a YouTube video where they have an original recording of the guy's friend was actually at the speech and got to hear it. But what was interesting is that it really started to frame the future of what technology could look like. And if you read about the speech, if you hear the snippets from it, Steve Jobs talked about and referenced things that wouldn't happen in technology for 2 or 3 decades into the future, and including there was a mention about how you talk with and possibly interact with computers from a voice standpoint. So nothing like we would think about today in terms of generative AI. But again, just kind of setting this foundation that even in the 1980s, there were visionaries a lot of them based in Texas, but Steve Jobs in particular, who really was looking at a future that the rest of us just didn't see or conceptualize yet. So this episode is not just about nostalgia for nostalgia's sake, right? It's about the roots of the Texas AI economy. Before the data centers, before the GPU clusters, before AI infrastructure became a boardroom issue, Texas was already building the hardware, the talent base, the business culture, and the entrepreneurial muscle that would make today's AI boom in Texas possible. So when we talk about Texas technology today, the conversation often jumps straight to startups in Austin, maybe to data centers in West Texas and the surrounding Dallas-Fort Worth area, and even to energy hubs in Houston and to the semiconductor fabs and the growing AI infrastructure build out across the state. But in the early 90s, Texas was still widely understood through a really different economic lens. It was oil, gas, real estate, defense, aerospace, retail, and traditional corporate power. And while technology was certainly present, it had not yet become the state's dominant story. And as we know, many of these industries, most all of those industries, are still here and vibrant across the state today. So it's not that they went away, but we just didn't have that view of Texas as a technology hub just yet. But the 80s was getting ready to transition that view for the world. So the decade really became a bridge between that old Texas economy and the modern digital economy. And this is all important for AI today because, as we know, AI requires chips. It needs servers, it needs networking, it needs storage, it needs power, and it needs a workforce and enterprise customers. So we have all of that today. But in 1980, that decade really helped Texas develop those muscles that we would use so much today. The decade gave Texas major personal computing companies, a stronger semiconductor identity, and a growing telecommunications corridor, a deeper base of engineers, and the early stages of what would later be known as Silicon Hills in Austin. So maybe instead of asking, when did Texas become an AI state, perhaps the better question is, when did Texas become the kind of place that could support an AI economy? One answer is the 1980s. So let's head to Houston and take a look at Compaq and the PC revolution. In 1982, three former Texas Instruments executives, Rod Kenyon, Jim Harris, and Bill Murdo, founded Compaq Computer Corporation. The origin story has really become a big legend, right, in technology history, because you had former Texas Instrument managers, a Houston restaurant, a sketch of a portable computer, and a bold idea. And that idea was not simply to build another computer, it was to build an IBM-compatible portable computer that could run the software that businesses were already beginning to adopt. Keep in mind that in the early 90s, IBM had created the personal computer standard that corporate America trusted, but IBM did not completely control all the pieces of that ecosystem. So that opened the door for companies that could build machines compatible with the IBM PC, machines that could run the same software, use the same operating environment, and fit into the same business workflows. Now, Compaq seized on that opportunity. So the Compaq Portable was announced in 1982, reaching the market the next year in 1983. It was not portable in the way we think of laptops today, but I hear that it was often described as a luggable computer. It weighed roughly as much as a small suitcase and looked kind of like a sewing machine case with a screen and keyboard inside. That's how it's described. But for its time, it was revolutionary. It gave business users the ability to take an IBM-compatible computer with them. More importantly, it proved that a startup in Houston could compete in one of the most important technology markets in the world. So by 1983, Compaq was no longer just an interesting Texas startup. It was one of the companies showing that the personal computer market could extend beyond IBM. And that would become a defining shift in the entire technology industry. Now, here's what's important when you think about today's AI economy. Compaq helped establish Texas as a place where serious computing companies could be built. It showed that Texas had technology that was not limited to components, calculators, defense systems, or back office corporate computing, right? Texas could genuinely produce a company that shaped the direction of personal computing itself. And I think there's another important connection. Compaq's founders came out of Texas Instruments, as we mentioned before. So that means one of the great Houston PC stories was also connected to the Dallas semiconductor and electronics ecosystem, which essentially what we're saying is that talent moved, ideas moved, experience moved. So Texas technology was already becoming a network. Now, today, when we talk about AI infrastructure companies, enterprise hardware, server supply chains, and the ability to commercialize complex technology, the Compaq story, I think it feels surprisingly current. The machine is different, stakes are different, but the pattern is familiar, right? We find a platform shift, we understand what businesses need, we build for compatibility and scale, and then we move faster than the incumbents. So now let's move north up to Dallas, where Texas Instruments was already a very important technology company recognized worldwide. By the 1980s, Texas Instruments had decades of experience in electronics, defense systems, calculators, computing, and semiconductors. The company was not new, clearly, but its role in the 90s is important because AI at its core depends on semiconductor progress. It is easy for us to talk about AI as software. We talk about models, prompts, chatbots, copilots, and agents, right? But none of it works without the hardware. AI runs on chips, it runs on memory, it runs on servers, it runs on networking equipment, it runs on data centers built around extraordinary amounts of compute. So this is why I think Texas Instruments belongs in this retro look back at technology in Texas. Because in the 1980s, TI was part of the semiconductor foundation that helped make Texas a serious technology state. The company's work in microelectronics, processors, memory, signal processing, and even embedded systems really helped create a deep engineering base in North Texas. There's also, I think, a fascinating detail that feels pretty relevant today. Texas Instruments had a professional computer in the early 1980s, and it offered a pioneering peripheral called the Speech Command System. SCS. And this was an advanced voice recognition and synthesis system that allowed users to give verbal instructions and dictate text. It was actually available for both the Texas Instruments computers as well as IBM. The Smithsonian, even today, has one of these speech systems in its permanent collection. So it does not mean clearly that Texas Instruments had anything like modern generative AI in mind, or that was part of what it did. But I think what is interesting to note is that thought, the ambition, the vision was very familiar, right? Make computers more natural to use. Let humans interact with machines in a way that feels less like programming and more like conversation. So that runs straight through the history of computing, from keyboards to mice, from graphical interfaces to voice commands, from search engines to AI assistants. The direction has been consistent. Reduce the friction between human intention and machine action, right? So Texas Instruments was not just selling parts, it was part of the long movement toward making computing more powerful, more useful, more personal, and more integrated into everyday work. So when we look at Texas today with semiconductor expansion, AI data centers, robotics, defense technology, and enterprise AI infrastructure, I think that the TI legacy is everywhere. It's in the talent base that we see today. It's in the supplier ecosystem. And it's in that idea that Texas can be a place where the physical foundation of computing also gets built. All right, now let's head back down to Austin and talk about someone named Michael Dell. In 1983, believe it or not, Michael Dell was preparing to enter the University of Texas at Austin. But within a year, he would begin selling upgraded PCs from his dorm room. And that business would become PCs Limited and then eventually Dell Computer and now today Dell Technologies. I think the Dell story is such a fun one. As an entrepreneur myself, anytime we heard stories about creating this huge monumental change type of business from a dorm room, from a garage. It was exciting, right? It was a signal that you could do it too. So I always love this story just because of that alone. But it's also a very important Texas business story of the modern era. But for this episode, I think what we're really talking about is not just that the fact that Dell did become a big global company, but it's how Dell became big. Dell really understood something that was very important about the PC market in early days, right? Customers did not all need the same machine. They wanted performance, price, customization, and direct access. And so I think Dell's direct to customer model really changed the way that computers were sold. And that model became one of the defining business innovations of the PC era. So the AI connection today is probably obvious. Dell Technologies is, of course, deeply involved in enterprise AI infrastructure with servers, storage, workstations, data center architecture, and partnerships that really help companies deploy AI at scale. But the roots of that AI infrastructure business goes back to that PC revolution and to a young founder in Austin who saw that technology markets could be rebuilt around customer needs. And by the way, it feels only right that I should also take a moment to mention, how impactful that entrepreneurial story continues to be today for another reason. Just last month in April, Michael Dell and his wife Susan announced that they were pledging or donating, I think, $750 million to UT Austin to help build an AI native medical campus and hospital. So you can see that bridge from the past remains very strong. And when you think of Austin, Dell's rise helped reinforce Austin's identity as a technology city, alongside companies like IBM and Motorola, and later the arrival of major semiconductor and research investments. So Dell became part of that foundation for, what became called Silicon Hills. But if you think about it, AI systems and AI ecosystems are not built from one company, and that's what makes it intriguing, fun, and filled with opportunity, I think, right? These ecosystems around AI are truly built from universities, startups, large employers, investors, technical workers, suppliers, and the customers, right? Everybody has a role in that ecosystem. And there's a lot of room for partnerships across that ecosystem. So the 1980s helped Austin become the kind of city where those networks and partnerships could form. It was really important. All right, another piece of the 1980s Texas tech story sits in North Texas, and that's with the growth of the Telecom corridor in Richardson and the surrounding Dallas area. So this region really became a magnet for telecommunications, electronics, and networking companies. And it built a concentration of engineers, corporate campuses, technical sales teams, and lots of infrastructure expertise. Now, at first glance, you might say, does telecom really sit within that AI story? But AI depends on networks. It depends on data moving between users, applications, servers, clouds, and devices of all kinds, right? It depends on that ability to connect distributed systems reliably. And so the telecom boom, I think, helped North Texas develop a technical workforce that really understood complex systems, enterprise customers, and mission critical infrastructure. And that's definitely relevant to today's AI economy that we talk about so much. And when we think about, the Dallas-Fort Worth as a major data center area and enterprise technology market, we're not talking about a region that just appeared suddenly to be this, right? Those roots do go back decades. And telecom definitely helped build the human and physical infrastructure that later technology waves could use and take advantage of. And I think that's what we are seeing today. So this is one of the patterns in the Texas story, right? Each technology era leaves behind assets for the next one. Semiconductors, they leave behind engineering talent. Telecom leaves behind networking expertise. PCs leave behind enterprise sales and supply chain knowledge. Data centers leave behind power and infrastructure capacity. AI builds on all of it. Well, all right, now let's talk about one other really interesting thing that happened in the 90s, and this also occurred in Austin. So there's this intriguing connection that happened between a national need that came into existence and then a group of companies and the government that came together to kind of answer that need. Not heard this story or not familiar with it, it's Sematech. So by the late 90s, you have to understand that the United States was actually worried about semiconductor competitiveness. Japan had become a really powerful force in chips, and American industry and government were looking for ways to strengthen that domestic manufacturing and research. Interestingly, I hope you're hearing these threads that maybe some of the players are different, maybe some of the technology is different, but the themes are certainly recurring over time. So hopefully you see that in this story as well. But to solve for that problem, it really helped lead to the creation of Sematech, which was a semiconductor manufacturing technology consortium that selected Austin as its headquarters in 1988. And as I mentioned, it was formed through this partnership between the U.S. Department of Defense via what was called DARPA and 14 major American semiconductor companies, which included Texas Instruments, IBM, and Intel, among others. Well, Sematech, I think, deserves, a major place in the Texas technology story because it reinforced Austin as a semiconductor center. It brought together industry, government, research, and manufacturing expertise around a strategic technology problem. Again, it sounds so familiar today, right? In the AI era, semiconductors are once again a national priority, and the question is not only who writes the best model or builds the best app, the question is who can produce and secure the chips, the equipment, the power, the facilities, and supply chains that make advanced computing possible. So in the late 1980s, Sematech really helped position Texas inside that national conversation. It made Austin more credible as a semiconductor hub, certainly, but I think also as a technology hub in general. And it strengthened the state's role just in advanced technology manufacturing as well. So today, as demand increases the pressure on compute infrastructure, as we've seen and talked about so much, I think that Texas is once again part of that national technology strategy. And that did not begin in 2026 or even last year in 2025, right? That groundwork was laid long before. So when you think about all of that foundation that was put in place, let's talk about what it is that the 1980s really got right about AI or AI. First, I think that during that decade, businesses, leaders began to understand that computing would move well into business life, into our personal lives. But the PC, most importantly, it stopped becoming seen as a hobbyist tool, and it really became a workplace necessity. And that shift, I think, is similar to what we're seeing now with AI. Although I will say, as we know, the resistance is strong. But I think there was this trend back in the 80s where companies were just moving from curiosity to implementation. Again, very much like what we're seeing right now with AI. Second, the decade showed the importance of compatibility in platforms. So Compaq succeeded because it understood the IBM PC ecosystem. Dell succeeded because it understood customer needs inside the expanding PC market. And today's AI companies face a similar reality. While they are driving this new world for all of us, they still must understand and be effective for our existing workflows, our cloud systems, our data environments, and our enterprise budgets. And they have to understand how to work across platforms, how to work together. And I think we're going to see that increasingly with AI when we talk about agents and do you use this AI system or that AI system. I think you're going to see more and more collaboration, and that's important. And I think that we saw that in Texas in the 80s. All right, so third, I think that the 1980s showed that geography matters. And with a statewide focus, there comes influence and opportunity. Look, Houston, Dallas, Austin, Richardson, right? They each played different types of roles. However, together, they created the statewide technology network. Well, finally, I think there's one more thing that I would add. I think that the decade also started to show that human imagination and ingenuity matter. The 1980s gave us leaders, innovators, visionaries who really had this view of what was possible for the future, even though the rest of us may not have understood it yet, could see it yet. Maybe they couldn't even fully define it yet. But you had this emphasis on using the human spirit to imagine, to dream, and to create. And I think that was so important. So the distance between, a 1983 portable computer and a modern AI data center probably seems and even sounds enormous. One fits awkwardly under your arm. The other consumes industrial scale power and runs models with billions or trillions of parameters, right? But I think the connection is genuine. The PC era taught businesses to digitize work. The software era taught them to manage information. The internet era connected all of that information for us. And the cloud era centralized and scaled it. So I think the AI era is now using it to generate, automate, predict, and truly assist. And Texas has been present across that arc. So today, when we see AI data centers in Texas, enterprise AI infrastructure from Texas-based companies, semiconductor investments, robotics, physical AI-related energy demand, we're seeing the latest chapter of a story that began decades earlier. The machines, the chips, the networks, the entrepreneurs, the customers, the workforce, the engineering talent, the belief that technology companies could be built in Texas and compete with anyone in the world. That is the real story of the 1980s and Texas and technology, in my opinion. Before AI became the phrase on every earnings call, before data centers became front page infrastructure stories, before generative AI changed the way we think about work, Texas was already busy building the foundation. The future, it didn't arrive all at once. It showed up in pieces, and sometimes in big luggable computers, and sometimes inside of a dorm room at a university, sometimes inside of a semiconductor lab, right? But those pieces came together, and now, more than 40 years later, that's hard to believe. Those pieces help explain why Texas is becoming one of the most important AI states in America. And I think that's a really nice story, and I'm excited to see how it continues to unfold. So that's it for today's episode of the IntoTexas AI podcast. As always, thank you for joining. And if you want to continue to get insights and just explore how AI is shaping and reshaping Texas, then I invite you to listen again, watch again, please share, and I'd love for you to subscribe as well. So thank you for joining me. I'm Shannon Belew, and I'll see you next time.